viewers. Hi, my name is Rob Farley. I'm an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Dr. Charli Carpenter, who is an associate professor in political science at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. How are you doing today, Charli?
I am fabulous. How are you, Rob?
I am fabulous as well. It's a very interesting looking day in Kentucky. It's very sunny and bright, but it's only about 60 degrees outside, which is a little bit cooler than it has been lately. And so the weather patterns this year is very strange. And
it's freezing here and windy, and of course they turned on the air conditioner, so I'm sitting in my office with my jacket on because it's freezing indoors as well. Tis the season.
Oh yeah, no. That's pretty standard with academic institutions. So you have the heat on for 4 months of the year, and you have the air conditioning on for 6 months a year.
Yeah, you roast all winter.
Right. And then it's these other months which are so uncomfortable along the way. So anyway, so we have a lot to talk about today.
We do.
I think that when we had initially thought up the idea of this blogging, because we had been focusing on Game of Thrones, but some more interesting stuff has developed since we came up with the idea of doing this blogging heads, and so we're still going to do some Game of Thrones oriented material for you Game of Thrones fans. But we're going to start off with a more traditional, or I guess more quasi-traditional, foreign entanglements topic, which is actually the study of foreign relations and international politics. Now, what sort of brings this up is that foreign policy. What did they call it exactly? What was this issue had a title, right?
The sex issue. That was the title. Yes.
The sex issue.
Yes.
And the cover for the sex issue was how would you describe it exactly?
A naked painted lady. A naked
painted lady.
Yeah.
But she also had a headscarf, right? Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly?
I'm not looking at the picture. She's dressed as a niqabi. She's covered up as if she's slicked in black oil, and she's painted black except for the slit from which her eyes look out silently and plaintively as a symbol of the oppressed woman of the Arab world. And this is the symbol of foreign policy's one issue that they, I guess, plan to devote to gender and global politics generally. And of course, it's been criticized. It caused an enormous controversy this past week in the Twitter sphere and in the blogosphere. Such that foreign policy actually, to its credit, created an entire roundtable on the website midweek, in which many female voices, many of them from the Arab world, provided their critique of the issue and of the image. But it's generated a lot of debate about what it means to do to look at gender issues in foreign affairs and to do so in a way that's not simplistic or stereotypical.
Right. And I mean, sort of what made this particularly fascinating were the assumptions that were embedded within it, right? That if you're going to do a sex issue, which is really more of a gender issue, it's an issue about gender, as I think we would describe it in political terms, even though that's not how they want to describe it, that the symbol of, or the way in which you approach doing a gender issue is to put a naked woman on the cover of your magazine, right? I mean, there were a variety of different things, right? You could have put a shirtless Vladimir Putin or something like that if you wanted to demonstrate, if you wanted to say something productive about gender. That would actually say also something productive about gender, right? But it wouldn't necessarily be a gender or sex issue, or at least people wouldn't think about it that way, even though the shirtless Vladimir Putin is quite clearly a sex and gender object. Or a shirtless Dan Dresner, too, would be another option, but I'm not sure if Dan would go for that. I mean, I suppose if they oiled him up or something, I don't know how that would work out. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of ways. I mean, you could do an issue on sex. I mean, you could do an entire issue that's just on sex, and I just think it needed to be much broader, because there's a lot of ways in which sex is political here in the U.S. For example, I think one of the big critiques of this issue came from the Arab and Muslim world, and also by extension from many voices in the global South. But the issue is it's not just conflating sex and gender, but it's using this discussion to essentialize non-Western cultures, and particularly the Arab Middle East, as being particularly perniciously sexist, in a way that is, well, it's not untrue, so in relative terms maybe, but it's neither helpful nor particularly balanced, because it makes it seem like that's where all the sexism is. And in fact, there are issues in all countries and transnationally that could be brought to bear here, and were basically neglected. And then the other critique about the cover art, as you point out, is that it's a bit demeaning of not just of Arab women, but of women in general, but it also actually undermines what's being said in the articles. The articles, some of them were quite good. Even Mona El-Tawani's article, which was it received the most critique because it was written, it was really slamming Arab gender relations, and it's written by this woman who's now based in the West, etc. So female activists in the Middle East were quick to say, you don't represent us, you don't represent all of us. Many men in the Middle East objected to the portrayals of male sexism, etc. But even those who thought this was an important and forthright and overdue piece, I felt that the pairing of this piece with this particular image really just undermined the whole thing and almost made a mockery of taking women's issues seriously. But then there's this third, broader critique, and I think this is where I was coming from in my post and where Megan McKenzie comes from in hers this morning, is that foreign policy just didn't go far enough, and that you're really dumbing down gender in foreign affairs if you make it all about sex and sexuality, or if you point fingers at certain places and not others. And that gender in foreign affairs isn't really only about women's sexuality in countries that we don't much like. If you do it that way, you're not just reproducing a bunch of stereotypes, but you're actually missing lots of insights about how gendered myths actually do make a difference in the way we construct our foreign policy, and how that could be changed.
Right. Now, was it you or Megan who observed, I think it was you, who sort of observed the claim that on this one issue we're changing this, and there was essentially this argument coming out of foreign policy, which again sort of suggested that gender issues are something that is only appropriate for one issue a year, or as the case may be, one issue every 10 years, in terms of serious conversation about foreign policy.
Yeah.
I guess, how do you think? I've had friendly conversations, and I publish in foreign policy, and I know that you publish in foreign policy and have friends there. How do you think that the conversations went down in terms of how to put this issue together? How did it make sense to people that this would be sort of an interesting, good effort to put it together? So let's put this together, one issue, rather than, say, try to intersperse gender issues across a whole series of different foreign policy magazines, none with nudity on the cover. How do people go about thinking that this particular approach is a good idea? What would be your guess?
I would be fascinated to know the answer to that. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall as a social scientist watching that unfold. I think the conversations must have been very interesting, and I wish the editors had written a longer explanation of what they were thinking and how they went about it, and they were a little more self-conscious and transparent about the choices they made. To some extent, some of these choices are defensible. So one thing you notice here is that it's very focused on women's rights. The issue is a lot of the articles are really not about gender and foreign affairs. They are about women's rights and foreign affairs, and why if women have more rights, certain policy outcomes in foreign affairs will be better. Which is a defensible claim on social science grounds, though it doesn't always hold true. So it's really more of an advocacy claim than it is analysis in some ways. Now, there's probably very good reasons for having that emphasis be very front and center in this issue. Maybe there was a discussion about whether this should be one issue or many articles. Do we want to do women? Do we want to do gender? Do we want to do sex? Do we want to do it all at once, or sprinkle it through, or do both? And maybe they actually are planning to do both. I actually think foreign policy has not done too poorly at incorporating gender into some of their articles, and I would love to be able to pull out some examples for you. I probably could in a future blog post. But Tom Ricks blogs a lot. about family policy in the military, for example. He has a post up on conscription right now, which is definitely a gender issue, even if he's not talking about it in those terms. So I think that foreign policy doesn't do too badly at this, and if they intend to do more of it in a more self-conscious way in the future, then this issue is not, then a single issue is not a bad way to kick that off. Why they chose to frame this issue in exactly the way they did, I'm not sure. I find it puzzling. And there's an interesting comment at the Monkey Cage today about magazine covers and how they're really all about they're not about framing issues at all. They're only about selling the magazine and getting you to open up to the story and then read it. So, I mean, maybe there was just a calculator. I'm not a graphic designer and I'm not a journalist. Maybe there was just a calculated marketing decision that was made that we're going to stir up a controversy with this issue, and here's how we're going to do it. And boy, they succeeded. If that was the goal, they're probably slapping themselves on the back now that it worked really well. And people actually read Melanie Van Veer's article, and they're reading Josh Keating's really interesting roundup of news stories relating to the way that states use gender in their population policies or in their policies on pandemics, etc. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But they left so much out, and they conflated so many things with, women's rights or sex, that it could have been done in a much more exhaustive way. And I think
right. And foreign policy is not a peer-reviewed journal or anything like that. But for a organization of its type, it does have an academic awareness about it, right? And so it's just impossible that people there didn't understand that they were conflating these terms. This is the first thing that leaps out at me when you say we're having an issue about sex. It's like, well, what? And I like that on your blog post you had the very obvious at the bottom, which is here are the different things that they were talking about, and here is the one word that they were using to talk about all these things. And so it was interesting to me that they seemed to have minimal academic awareness of how ambiguous and contested the terminology they were using was, which is surprising coming from them.
I also sort of wonder. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I interrupted you. Well, I was going to say
okay.
I'm actually not as hung up on the terminologies as I was on the message. In fact, I used to teach a course called Gender and Security back when I taught at University of Pittsburgh in the policy program. And in the second semester I taught it, I changed the title to Sex, Power, and Security because I realized that was a better way to recruit male students into my class. And that worked brilliantly. And so then we had mixed gender classes, and it was a much better learning dynamic, I thought much more productive. But I had to sort of switch the terminology around to trick them into signing up. But then, of course, once they got into class, I wasn't teaching all about, sex and pornography and this and that. I was teaching about all, gender, really, and the difference between sex and gender and different ways of looking at it. And I wouldn't have minded the cover nearly as much had I liked the package of articles inside better. And I think individually a number of them were not bad, but as a whole it was not a very representative sample of what you would want to get if you were being offered a sort of single punch survey of how gender matters in foreign policy. And that's where I was disappointed, and perhaps my expectations are a little too high because I am an academic and I teach this stuff, but I think if I had been the foreign policy editor, sort of knowing that I'm charting new territory for my publication, I probably would have brought in a guest assistant editor for that issue who had some grounding, could really walk them through and consult on different strategies for walking that line between marketing and dumbing it down enough, but also having a consistent and representative message.
Now, I mean, if I asked you, what do you think that they did right? What would you say? I mean, certainly elements of their response have been sort of, as we would broadly term, they've done right. I mean, they have been responsive to concerns. They've set up a round table. They have been open about the conversation they started. They've tweeted a lot about it. They have blogged a considerable amount about it. And so, in that sense, I think that part they've clearly done right in terms of being responsive to the criticism. I mean, what else would you say sort of has been, broadly speaking, done right about the process of producing this issue.
Okay, well, first of all, I think it was great that Mona El-Tahani wrote that article instead of Nicholas Kristof. So they picked not only a woman, but an Arab woman and a Muslim woman, or a woman originally from the Middle East, and a Muslim to actually comment on the problems with gender misogyny in the Middle East. They probably needed to pair it with a different kind of feminist voice also from the region, but so that was much better than having a white male American women's advocate finger-pointing at the Muslim world. I liked that they paired sort of her perspective with the perspective of a practitioner, Malin Revere, who really gave sort of the why women's rights are important to everybody argument, with Valerie Hudson, an academic who actually has the data to back that argument up. And I like that Hudson's article was again still very heavy on sort of women's rights, but she did tie that in well at the end to why this matters for other things we might care about, like global stability. And I think that what I would have liked to see is more of that train of thought in the supporting articles for the issue, which were fairly trite, actually. The one on marriage in China, the one on, there were a number of issues about sort of how lascivious male elites in the Middle East are toward the women. It was just, that one thread was beaten over our heads so many times, but we didn't have a number of different slices on this question about why gender matters to the things that foreign policy readers also care about, like peace negotiations and the global financial crisis, and how to get North Korea not to build nuclear weapons, etc. So if you could find ways of tying gender, they did really seem to have there was an othering of problems, right? I mean, it was. I mean, it really seemed as if that as you suggested earlier, these issues were really being spoken of as these are major issues that other cultures have, which surely they are, but that sort of just leaves aside the question of they being major issues within our own cultural milieu. And gender in foreign policy isn't all about women's rights. I think one of the most interesting ways that gender functions in foreign policy is precisely the way that we saw it functioning in this special issue, which is as a way of drawing boundaries between us and them through reference to culture's relative ill treatment of women. So you could have done an entire investigative analysis of that dynamic, of how that process works to affect outcomes in diplomacy and in public discourse and in global policy, and how the foreign policy press can avoid buying into that in the future in the way they cover these issues and construct them. I mean, there's just so many. Another way gender functions is by telling us what has value, what's important and what isn't. It's not just women that are devalued. It's anything associated with femininity or characteristics we associate with femininity. So you could do a really interesting piece on how that affects peacekeeping operations. So the success of peacekeeping missions, for example, not just something simplistic like if we have more women in these missions, are they more effective, and not an expose on exploiting local women sexually. But this whole notion about what peacekeeping culture does to notions about warrioring and what's manly and how that's changing civil-military relations worldwide. I mean, these are also gender issues.
Right. No, they are all gender issues, and they're also, I mean, so both of those approaches are, from an academic point, actually quite interesting, and both of those approaches should have representation in the regular cycle of articles in magazines like Foreign Policy.
Yes, and they should not be, and they should be mainstreamed into each article.
Well, we're talking about women in this issue, so let's see what's the data on women and peacekeepers. Right, because that would not be relevant for any other issue this year, I guess.
Right. No, I agree. So, the coverage should regularly focus. Some of it should cover women's issues and women's movements worldwide, and how global policy is affecting women and minority or other gender minorities. I should add, there wasn't much about queer politics or discrimination against gays or transgender in this issue either. But a lot of there should be regular content. There should be sort of regular gender sensitivity just mainstreamed into the normal course of writing in these journals, if you want to provide an accurate understanding of how world affairs really functions. And it's harder. I mean, it's easy to see how gender matters if you're writing about women's issues, and it's harder if you're not trained to do it to see how it matters when your point of reference is peace negotiations or stability operations or anti-narcotics efforts or nuclear non-proliferation. But if we can start to see it there and how gender matters in those cases, then that's really much more transformative.
Right, you have to ferret it out in those occasions, and that's not too hard to do. But you also, and I guess maybe this is, maybe we can relate some of these issues to issues in the academy. Not only do you have to ferret it out, but it has to be, those sorts of considerations have to be transformed into a language that the readers of Foreign Policy are going to react to, which is a different language than the other audiences we normally associate with those sorts of questions, which are broadly an academic audience, is a different language than that audience responds to.
That's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
And that gets us back to like the policy academia divide and a whole bunch of other interesting questions. Well, instead of talking about that, let's use this as an opportunity to smoothly segue into something else. Go ahead.
Can I say one more thing, and then I will segue, because I think I know where you're going.
You can say one more thing.
Well, one more thing is that I know that my post was very critical, but the other thing that they did right was they made the effort. Okay, and I would just say the other thing is not to let the fear of not getting the language right keep people from trying. I have enormous respect for the foreign policy editors for at least putting together the issue. So doing gender analysis poorly or half-heartedly or packaging it badly is much better than failing to acknowledge that it matters at all. So I think they deserve a lot of credit, and I think this trend toward making a well-intentioned effort is something that we're actually increasingly seeing across the board, a number of elite Beltway foreign affairs journals, and that's a good thing. And I don't know if you were encouraging us to segue toward Game of Thrones or toward something else.
Well, I was encouraging us to segue towards elite Beltway foreign affairs journals.
Yeah, exactly.
One, for example, being Foreign Affairs.
Well, right, but
which also gets us to Game of Thrones, because you basically wrote an article in which you discussed some gender, but also some more broadly theoretical aspects of Game of Thrones. I mean, you suggested there was an interesting story behind this article. Anyway, I mean, if I can set it up a little bit, last year, so Game of Thrones is, of course, a thing now, and last year was the first season of the television show. Although the books, there are now 5 books, they're all like 7,000 pages long, and we can talk a little bit about that too in the transition. But many commentators who, I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Are you there?
No, go ahead. I was going to say, I was going to tie that to the gender point I was making, but we can just go finish what you were saying. I'm sorry, it's very hard. Well, I was going
to set up the article. So the article is essentially pushing back against the idea that a lot of people argued, starting out after watching the first season of Game of Thrones, that this is fundamentally a realist world, a realpolitik world, where force and the sword are effectively decisive at all points, and so this is a world without liberal illusions or even traditional illusions, right? I mean, just no social illusions whatsoever. That the blade and the bow, and essentially the Hobbesian realpolitik vision. And your piece was really pushing back against that in a number of ways. So segue to you.
Well, it was. I was really trying to make the case that the show and the book series are much more subversive of realism than it would seem. And I talked a little bit about, the role of ethics and the role of norms, and how it seems as if, especially when you get to the end of season 1, that the moral of the story is that those things don't matter and you're a fool if you think they do. But what I argue is that, in fact, the whole show is an allegory for the perils of unfettered realpolitik, and that norms and ethics and kinship matter very much, and that there's also been this critique of misogyny in the show, that the sex is very gratuitous and the women are all disempowered, and whores are the some of the main characters, and it's just very sexist series, and I made the opposite argument. I said what George R.R. Martin is showing in the book is a counterpoint to a very gendered narrative, which is this fantasy notion of chivalry and knights defending beautiful, virtuous women against monsters, which is very much part of that genre. And actually, it is a critique of the brutality of feudal gender relations and his characters, the way he has the different female characters deal with their circumstances. Can be construed as as embodying a number of different feminist archetypes. Now, it's actually interesting. I wanted to just say one thing, following up from this notion about foreign policy journals gradually beginning to take gender a little more seriously. There's a really interesting conversation I had with the foreign affairs editor as this article was it was about to go online. And he had paired Cersei's picture with the piece. If you click on it, you'll see. And I was surprised by that because
it's really kind of a GIF more than a picture because it moves, right? That picture moves.
Yeah, it's a special picture.
I sat watching it for a while.
Well, I had barely discussed Cersei actually in the piece, but I discussed Daenerys quite a lot in that paragraph where I talk about feminism and also humanitarianism. And Gideon said he didn't want to use Dany's picture because he thought it wouldn't pair well with a feminist piece, a feminist article, because she was so sexualized as a character. And I thought, on the one hand, couldn't they find an image of Dany that wasn't sexualized, like the horse heart-eating picture or something? Yes, she's beautiful, but she's also this incredibly ferocious warrior. But then I thought, and the other thing I thought was, I only wrote really a few lines about gender in this piece. It's actually not a feminist article, it's a constructivist article, but somehow that makes it feminist. But I also just wanted to say, this is an example of where you have to give Gideon a ton of credit for actually being so thoughtful, both about the content and about the imagery that he's associating with the piece. Not only whether to use a woman versus to use Tyrion or something, but what kind of image. So I think we see more and more of that in foreign policy circles, and I appreciated it, but I didn't see feminism as the most important part of this piece. I think that there's a feminist critique there, but I think it's it's sort of an example of this broader critique about looking at sort of feudal social relations, but also war narratives generally through the eyes of the underclass and the marginalized, and not only through the eyes of the powerful. And I think that's actually a narrative that really runs counter to the realist story of world politics.
Right. I mean, well, it is feminist insofar as any good constructivist account, or a constructivist response to a realist argument has to be feminist, right? That it has to sort of undermine what really goes, in many cases, all the way down to a realist approach to appreciation of what ought to be normal family relations, right? Which is certainly something that underlies realism, often so deep it's hard to dig up, but that's certainly there.
Yeah.
And any good attack, not really attack, but any good critique of a realist argument, I think, will almost invariably have that kind of feminist component to it, right? Because it does sort of drive to the assumptions about domesticity, the assumptions about family life that I think are analyzed very capably in the Martin books. But can also be analyzed. I mean, you can do an external analysis of, for example, the same things in Tolkien, right? And Tolkien's not quite as, I don't think he's quite as bad as some of his critics suggest on these issues, but he's not great. But Martin, I mean, contrasting Martin and Tolkien, it just becomes so powerfully obvious what's going on in Martin, right? And part of that is a critique, I think, as you suggest, of this realpolitik understanding that goes all the way down to sort of very foundational domestic household relationships and understandings of what those ought to be. I mean, we should say, and we may talk a little bit about the idea of spoilers in a second, but we are going to feel free, at least for the next few minutes, just to talk about what's going on in the show. So if you don't want to know what happened through last week's show, don't listen to this next part. But it's interesting that there is this, that there was this. I can see from the image point of view that there was this this nervousness about Dany and a preference for Cersei, because Cersei rarely appears nude in the show, which is apparently because the actress Lena Headey has lots of tattoos, and so it's hard to cover them all up. Anyway, that's just what I read today. Anyway, but
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean that's Alyssa Rosenberg wrote about that today, which I guess for a production which isn't, I mean, it's a good sized budget, but I can understand why you wouldn't want to go through the process of covering up the tattoos every time that she was nude. So
I would like to say that I think there's a very big there's been a lot of criticism of the nudity and the gratuitous sex in Game of Thrones, and I will add, because I've just done this critique of gratuitous nudity in a different context, that I don't necessarily think that's a problem with this show. I'm not as bothered by it as some, and I think the reason for that is that I don't see it as it doesn't strike me as particularly pornographic. I mean, I know that or not intending to be. I think that George R.R. Martin is just very practical about sex and sort of shrugging his shoulders at it as he writes, in a way that traditional fantasy isn't. Traditional fantasy is almost just very puritanical about it, and Martin is just kind of like, bodily function, just like the horse putting its droppings in the street. This is what life is like, and so I think the show is reflecting that in some ways that trouble or bother people. But if anything, I'd just like to see more male nudity in the show. but so that's I think that there's a difference between nakedness and nudity in the kind of gender connotations that we associate with them, and so the whole discussion about that is interesting. I find the violence in the show to be much more disturbing than the sex, and rightly so. It should be, and I think it's actually
and one of the most disturbing. Well. I mean, I think that sort of everyone has fingered one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire show was in last week's episode with Joffrey and the two prostitutes, and that sort of. I
thought the torture of the prisoners was far more disturbing. I mean, Joffrey was also torturing prisoners in that scene.
It was an extremely troubling. It was an extremely troubling show, and I think again, sort of Alyssa Rosenberg, who's at Think Progress, wrote about the torture of the prisoners and wrote about how big of a difference there is between what that scene looked like in terms of torture than what you ever saw in 24 or what you even see in your typical police procedural, where even if the torture doesn't work, even if it's sort of condemned, which it isn't always done. This was so different in that it was, so obvious that the torturers were doing this for fun, right? I mean, they were clearly doing it for fun. They didn't give a damn. Yeah. And then, as someone pointed out later, you are so happy when Tywin Lannister shows up, right?
I know, right?
He's not a nice man, but he shows up and he saves the day, right? And it's like, oh my God, thank God Tywin Lannister shows up, which is, it's like, thank God Voldemort's here to, stop all this from happening.
But see, but it's really an interesting scene. I was probably would have blogged about this if I wasn't doing blogging heads today, but it's an interesting scene because why does he stop the torture? Well, because it serves no practical purpose. In fact, undermines his practical purposes. He'd rather use the prisoners as forced laborers than waste them by killing them, by torturing them to death. So that's his logic. And I think it's interesting to see, and bear in mind, if you've read the books, Tywin Lannister is not a person, he is not lily-livered when it comes to what we would consider crimes against humanity, if they serve a tactical purpose. And he simply doesn't like to waste atrocity when it serves no purpose. He's not a sadist. And so this is a very interesting distinction, I think, politically and in terms, if you study war crimes as I do. But I think it also points to something very important, which is that if you make arguments that we should promote human rights because it serves our interests, which is very much what the articles in that foreign policy issue were doing, by the way, about women's rights. It's not that women have rights and we should protect them even when it goes against our interests. It's that we should protect women's rights because it helps us, because it makes states more peaceful, because it makes, if we develop if we educate girls, countries will develop and they'll be more stable, etc. The scene with Tywin Lannister is in some respects an inversion of that, or it's the embodiment of that logic. Let's not torture prisoners because we need them. Whereas if Tyrion Lannister thought it was in his interest to torture those prisoners, he would have no problem with it. And I think that it's very important to be careful about conflating human rights with interest-based behavior per se, even though they may sometimes coincide. It's a trick to see. We do want to see Tyrion as the good guy. In that scene, he seems to be, but that's also a trick. And I think that the show is going to remind us of those gradations constantly in different ways.
Right. Well, I mean, I want to go back a little bit because, again, with the piece that you talked about and how a picture of Cersei was used instead of a picture of Dany. There's a series of and I can't help it that Martin wants us to make these comparisons, although the last two books sort of make it more difficult because they're actually in different books. But there is really a very interesting set of comparisons to be made between the characters of Cersei and Dany. And it's also interesting that, sort of as you suggest, the critique of the show, I think less in the books, but of the show, as misogynistic, has focused so much on Dany rather than on Cersei. And that seems to be almost entirely a visual concern rather than sort of an interest in their characters.
No, I don't agree. I think it's very consistent with the books. Because you see things through Dany's eyes from the very second chapter, I think, of the first book. It's not until 3 books in that you see anything through Cersei's eyes. She's one of the bad characters in the early days, and you start only later to really understand her character. And there are characters, I don't think he ever does that for her father, Tyrion Lannister. So
no, Tyrion, he never has a...
Yeah. I think the show, if anything, is doing better by Cersei, and some of the quote-unquote bad characters than the books did, and more quickly, earlier on. I think season 2 has been particularly good in that regard. We've had scenes, and they've actually made up some scenes. The show's not been consistent in some ways. The scene with in season 1 where Cersei is talking to Catelyn about her child who died, and they're bonding as mothers. That's not actually in the book, and she had no child by Robert in the books. She aborted all her fetuses by him. So whether or not we're meant to think she's tricking Catelyn, which she is, if you're consistent with the book, or whether whether that scene is actually about making Cersei human, I'm not sure. But for people who haven't read the books, I think that's what scenes like that do, and I think that's a self-conscious effort on the part of the producers to really show us the humanity in all the characters and how each of them represents bits of us to which we can relate, even if they're doing things we don't agree with.
Right. But I mean, even after Cersei gets her point of view spotlight, she's still, probably the least sympathetic character in the entire series so far.
Really?
I think so. Even, certainly, less in terms of point of view characters. I would think so. I'm not sure who else would you be thinking of?
Well, I guess that depends on if you think of Cersei as a point of view character.
Well, in the book, she is a point of view character.
Later she is. Yeah.
There are chapters written about her point of view. So,
I think it changes throughout the series. I think Tyrion is a much more sympathetic character in the early books than he becomes. And I won't say more because some viewers may not have read the books and we're only in season 2. But that's also part of the genius of the show, is that it's not always clear who the good and bad guys are. That changes, and it changes as people have experiences that change their perspective and their personalities, or as they make choices. Theon is in the process of making choices that are going to have implications for him and for his family, but we're also... I think the series also did a better job than the books at helping you see where those choices came from and how the anguish that they came from and some of the history there. And so even when you see someone making very poor choices, you have some empathy for them, and that is that's subversive in a way of the war narrative we tell ourselves, which is that the enemies are bad guys.
And I think in so many other, just in last week's episode, for example, just the character of how Marjorie Tyrell has been dealt with so far. I mean, the conversation between her and Littlefinger was really a fantastic conversation in that episode. It was clever, sort of revealed things about both characters, and that's not in the book, right? I mean, there's no... we get so little indication of what her character actually is in the books, and certainly not this point in the books. And so there is a great deal more warmth sort of revealed about the characters. I do sort of wonder, because Tyrion is clearly going to be the hero of the second season. Spoiler, Tyrion is going to be the hero of the second season, and everybody's going to be cheering and waiting to see Tyrion again. And I think that as things go on, as you're quite right, Tyrion's role grows considerably more dark in a way that TV audiences aren't normally accustomed to see as series go on. Right? I mean, the story about what happens to characters, what happens to ambiguous characters in a television series is almost always that they move toward blight, right? And this is Margaret Houlihan and MASH. This is certain of the evil characters on Lost and so forth that all sort of become more sympathetic as the series goes on. And that doesn't really happen with Tyrion, at least not in the same way. And especially because Dinklage himself is such an appealing figure. It's very interesting to see how they're going to do with it. But I want to get back to the Cersei Dany comparison that I've been trying to drag us back to for a second here.
Drag away. And then I have a question for you as well.
Okay, all right. They are parallel characters. I mean, we are shown in such an explicit way that Dany is being married off against her will purely for political reasons. But it's an undercurrent. It's also sort of talked about, and we just don't have it as sort of explicitly given to us that Cersei, that exactly the same thing has happened to Cersei, right? That she didn't want to get married to Robert. That she just wanted to have sex with her brother, which is exactly what Dany expected to have happen in her life too. Interestingly enough. And so going back, it's interesting to me that so much of the critique of the show as having a misogynist perspective has focused on Dany rather than Cersei.
It's an interesting point. It's an interesting point.
And all I can come back to is it's because the show shows more skin for Dany than for Cersei.
No.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I mean, they both seem to have. I mean, if anything, Dany has sort of even more sort of aggressive set of responses to the situation that she's been. I don't know. I guess Cersei is kind of murderous. So I don't know. So
here's a couple of ways to read that. One is. I actually think it has a lot to do with being consistent with the books, and I hadn't actually thought fully about all the parallels you just described. That was brilliant. You might think that maybe what Martin was doing was using Dany's character as a way to help readers understand Cersei and where she came from, because when you think about it, they do have very similar lives, but we don't get to see Cersei at that age. Sort of as she comes of age in this context where she is being treated as a pawn and she does grow to resent it, etc. And what are her strategies? But we're seeing some of that in the early years of Dany in this very parallel situation. But they're also occupying very different subject positions, as that's how a feminist would put it. Dany is essentially fighting an insurgency. She is trying to come back from exile and she's trying to recapture the state. Cersei's already in control of the state. And what tends to happen is that women, actually in actual politics, is that you see women being very, very ferocious, very accepted as political agents in revolutionary movements. And then when the movements recapture the state, they are often relegated to a much more backdoor role where they may be exercising some influence, but they're not accorded the kind of agency that they had hoped for or would respect. So we see this is one of the truisms that a gender theorist would say about revolutions and statecraft and international politics. Same way, someone who studies large data sets on war would say democracies don't fight one another. So that's one way of reading the two characters, is Dany is more sympathetic as sort of a feminist revolutionary character, and she seems to have more power in that regard in her context, but it's partly because she hasn't yet become a queen, and presumably, and as we will see later in the books, part of becoming a queen means selecting a king, and what kind of trade-offs will that have for her in terms of her own power position. And so I think it's possible to think about Cersei through the lens of Dany, if you want to go that direction. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that these are two very different female archetypes. They're both mothers, and they're both sort of using a maternal politics to get what they want. But they
both have 3 children.
Yeah. Well, Dany is a mother in a different way. She's the mother of dragons, and she's the mother of her refugee clan. So she's using maternal politics without being physically a mother. Cersei is doing the opposite. But they're very different in terms of, they're both strong women, but I think only one of them is a feminist character in the sense that only Dany cares about women's rights. Cersei she's kind of a liberal feminist archetype because she's a strong woman who's just as good as men. And she's she's also not going to use her power for anybody's good. Except for her own children.
Okay, so let me pause. Can I pause you for a second?
Sure.
I'm sorry. As if you're something I can just push a button on and pause. But I am not sure that that's the right description of Cersei.
Okay.
Right? I'm not sure that's. Well, I'm not sure how that's how the characters in and alert. We are going to be moving into book spoilers here. So if you don't want to hear any book spoilers. The other characters, I think, especially those characters associated with Dorne, seem to believe that Cersei has a larger agenda, not just about her own power, but also about her daughter and so forth, right? And of course, things are done much differently in Dorne, and I haven't read far enough to know whether Cersei ever does find that sort of way of approaching the question attractive. But I think you can ferret out, I think I've used that phrase 5 or 6 times now in this dialogue, you can work out a vision of how Cersei understands the world that isn't just about Cersei as being deprived of access to power, but that you can find her where she actually does seem sort of genuinely unhappy that she and people like her lack access to power, right? Which is why they seem to think in Dorne that making Myrcella heir would be something that Cersei would find attractive, right? And maybe that's just Cersei, but or it's just about her. But
we should pick this up when you finish Dance with Dragons. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that subtext is as relevant or important as you might think it is at this point, but it also could be that I just didn't tune into it. Could be. I have a question for you, though. It's a slightly different direction.
All right, so you were going to ask me a question that doesn't have to do with Cersei
Well,
Lannister.
maybe. My question is about race in Game of Thrones, and that's, earlier you had said something, I wasn't quite sure I agreed with it, which is that if you do a constructivist, if you do an counter-realist interpretation of anything through an IR lens, you have to include feminism and gender. And I'm not entirely sure that's true. I think you could do that in a number of ways. I think feminism and gender is a really useful way that's always available to you. But another way to ask those same questions about marginality and power and language and assumptions is to look at socioeconomic class, or it is to look at race, for example, or disability. There's many different ways in which those themes kind of cut across one another. And so there's, my piece, I touched on some of this in my Foreign Affairs piece, but I think to a lesser extent than perhaps I should have. And there's been some really other interesting writings on representations of race as well as gender in the show. And some, I think, those have been a lot less flattering. In fact, Vikash Yadav has a piece up this morning sort of written in the voice of a disgruntled Dothraki spokesperson about representations of Dothrak in the show, and caricatures of the barbarian other, etc. So to the extent that the Game of Thrones is progressive in the ways that we are discussing, sort of a parable of world politics that suggests norms and human security should matter, and that perhaps takes gender issues seriously, can the same be said about minority races, about racial difference in the show, etc.? Or what's your take on some of that?
Right. Yeah, I read Vikash's post, and I think that there was question is about representations of race in Game of Thrones, and how they run against this court. And so, as I was saying, I read Vikash's post, and I mean, the first thing is that on the question of whether constructivism inevitably has some sort of gender component, right? I mean, it was sort of interesting that many of the elements of the post discussed how the Dothraki were othered because of their gender relations, right? I mean, that this was a component of their othering, right? But I have to come back, and I have always been fascinated by how Tolkien handled the same kind of representations. And in Tolkien's case, the Dothraki essentially are some combination of sort of swarthy Easterners, when I think that even that term is actually used, swarthy, and orcs, right? And a question about this is about Martin is, to what extent has his depiction of the Dothraki sort of broken out of that Tolkienian mode, right? On the one hand, we certainly have a lot more detail about what the Dothraki are, who they are, how they think about life, how they approach life, than we ever do about sort of Tolkien's nameless antagonists. And so that's something, right? That at least we have a, what's the word I'm looking for? We have an ethnography of the Dothraki, and in the sense that we don't from other kinds of other similar fantasy epics. There were a couple other bits that weren't quite accurate about Vikash's post. It's not quite as if Danny is this kind of white liberator that we are familiar with from many different kinds of literature where the white person shows up and provides leadership to a people of color. It's clear that she's not viewed as leader. She's not, in how the Dothraki would think about it. Her horde is extremely small. Her horde is not very powerful. To the extent that she builds an army, it is not primarily of Dothraki. It eventually becomes a whole coalition of different peoples. But at the same time, I think that there is certainly something about Vikash's post and the more general critique of the Dothraki as an unreconstructed fantasy racial other that bite into. I guess another difference between Tolkien and Miller on this point, or Martin, I'm sorry, is that Tolkien is explicitly colonialist, right? I mean, he's really quite clear that the people of the West can and ought to rule over these subject people of color, right? That they have in the past ruled over these people, that they should defeat the Haradrim, they should exterminate the orcs. They have these within their capabilities. So there is a sort of a set of specifically colonial assumptions about the relationship between white and people of color in Tolkien. And you don't quite say the same thing in George R.R. Martin, right? I mean, in part, you can read this as a book of Crisis of Westeros, right? In the same way that it would not necessarily, and I think that he's made this same parallel, it would not necessarily be useful to bring racial analysis into a history of the War of the Roses. Now that analysis obviously doesn't hold 100%, but I think you can go in and you can see we really are operating on different assumptions in how Martin and, say, Tolkien think about this relationship with the racial other.
I can see your point.
Even if Tolkien hasn't, or even if Martin hasn't advanced very far in terms of sort of a transformational understanding of that other.
I can see your point. It does. You're basically saying, so the show starts where it's familiar to the Western reader, which is in this fantasy world that is essentially a fictionalized Northwestern feudal Europe. And then there's these other worlds on the periphery, and we get glimpses of them, and they're simplistic, and they sort of buy into stereotypes we have. But even with the Dothraki and the story of Dany, there's a complexity there that's lacking in, and there's a humanity there that's lacking in these sort of standard evildoers of fantasy fiction. But I think it gets even more complicated than that as the series progresses, and you're seeing this in the books already, and viewers are seeing it already in the second season, which is becoming much more complex. Suddenly now we have this kingdom, we have the Tyrells, and we're about to meet the Dornish, and we've met the Ironborn, which is this group we didn't even know about in season 1, and so and then above the wall, right? There's all of these wildlings, and so there's this. The periphery is getting much, much bigger relative to the core and much more important, and I think that's psychologically that's very interesting, even though we're never going to understand the periphery as well as we understand the core, because the core is where the main characters are, and there's a reason for that, right? The show is designed to appeal to and critique some of the war narratives that are associated with Western culture. But I think that Martin is probably, I haven't thought this through, I'm just thinking aloud, in reaction to what Prakash wrote this morning, but it does seem to me that you could argue Martin is doing something much more complex in exposing us through the main characters. Tyrion, for example, later, if you're not to that point in the series yet, you soon will be, makes a sort of a pilgrimage to the periphery under some very interesting circumstances, in which, and so through him we're going to meet all kinds of other lands and characters we didn't know, and see the world of Westeros through some very different perspectives. And so that is, in a way, what critical theory asks us to do. Critical theories of international relations ask us to look at ourselves through others' eyes, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we can never fully understand the complexity of other cultures. And certainly in an HBO series, I would imagine it's going to be, any treatment of these other lands is going to be much more watered down than even the books was. That's true of the Dothraki as well. Does that mean it's racist? Well, I think Prakash makes really good points, and some of these other commentators do, but I agree with you that there's gradations in how you do that. And if you are at least showcasing power relations and confronting the reader with how little they understand of the other and why that might matter to their goals, that's subversive and constructive in some ways. I will say one more thing, and maybe go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh no! I wasn't going to say anything useful. You go ahead.
Were you? I didn't know if you were responding to that. Fine. If you were looking for a segue, I would just. I'm interested in sort of expanding the conversation beyond Game of Thrones, actually, and to pop culture generally. I mean, I was so delighted that Foreign Affairs was willing to publish that piece, because in a way it was just a validation of this argument that pop culture matters in shaping and making sensible our understandings of foreign policy. And if that's true, and if we're right that these kinds of cultural artifacts are much more critical than conventional narratives, then that's probably good for developing a more critical foreign policy. And I actually wonder what you make of that argument, this notion that these kinds of stories are war narratives, and war narratives in pop culture, be they TV or film or video games, which you've written about recently, are not just reflections of civil-military relations, but actually are civil-military relations in some way, sort of a way of legitimizing certain military doctrines or certain foreign policies at certain points in history with a mass audience. And Olivier Schmidt made that case recently, right, in his Alien Invasion blog post. And I just wonder if that is your argument as well when you write about themes in Civilization or Battlestar Galactica or Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, I think that you, when you bring up, I was sitting here. I was not actually looking for segue. I was being very thoughtful about what you had said, and I wasn't sure quite how to react to it. But anyway, I'll stop being thoughtful now.
Or you can tie both together. It doesn't matter.
No. Well, we'll let it tie itself together. that you mentioned Battlestar Galactica is very interesting, right? Since Battlestar Galactica, I think, had an intentionally, almost explicitly, didactic intent in some sense, right? About civil-military relations, about supreme emergency, sort of about a society essentially being forced to reconstitute itself under conditions under crisis-like conditions that was not accidental in context of when the miniseries came out and then when the rest of the series came out in 2003. And certainly, and this because your blog, Deca Minerva, you have Patrick and you have Dan, and they both do so much good work in terms of pop culture and international politics, right? And so, the reason that so many of us are studying this in such productive ways, I think, right now, is because we do sort of come to understand how these pop culture understandings of the world don't simply provide counterfactuals, right? They do provide sort of interesting social science counterfactuals, right? And that's one reason we find them attractive. But we also find them attractive because they structure our understanding of these things, right? And so, what I wrote about last week in terms of Civilization 4, many more people are going to play the game Civilization than are ever going to read Mahan, right? I mean, maybe that wouldn't have been true 100 years ago, even if they had Civilization, but it's true now. And so to the extent that we come to have understandings of sea power, to the extent that we come to understand the crisis of civil military relations, to the extent that we understand what air power does, things like Civilization 4 and Battlestar Galactica and Top Gun are not simply interesting artifacts for academic study, but are actually policy relevant is not the right way to say it, right? But they are real world relevant, right? They're something that matters in the context of how we construct and we appreciate our reality.
I'm actually interested in...
And Go ahead.
Well, I wonder if you think the causality runs in reverse, right? Not only that these cultural artifacts shape people's understanding of foreign policy, but I also wonder if policy processes shape the artifacts themselves as well. And if, so like this, I know you're horrified by the new film that's coming out, Battleship. We haven't seen it yet because it hasn't yet been released here, but of course it's been released in Europe, and Oliver Schmidt also blogs about that. And his argument is that there's actually an interesting relationship, if you look over time, between military doctrine and what's going on in U.S. military doctrine, and what kinds of, so which branches of the armed forces are privileged in blockbuster Hollywood films at the time. And I don't know, I know you studied naval relations and you study air power, and here there's been quite a lot of alien invasion films that have privileged air power, like Independence Day, and here we have this new one where it's really the Navy. And I just wonder if you make anything... And I think his post was sort of thinking aloud, and in the comments people were debating whether there actually is any kind of relationship between what the U.S. military is doing and wants people to accept and what Hollywood then does. And I don't know, as a social scientist, I don't know.
I think the causality runs both directions. And I think it runs in the direction that, there is absolutely zero question that the bureaucracy writ large, governmental bureaucracy writ large, cares about the way that popular culture affects perceptions and tries to structure the way that happens. And it does this through really obvious and even fairly crude attempts, like Top Gun, for example. But the way in which these artifacts actually have an impact in how we live, how we think about military force, and so forth, is really unpredictable. Mm-hmm. It's unpredictable, and it's complex, and it goes beyond simply what direction policy is supposed to be driving. And it's sort of, Top Gun, I think, is a tremendously fascinating film. It was extremely effective in the short term for the U.S. Navy in creating a tremendous number of recruits, and a lot of people thinking F-14s were cool, and a lot of people thinking that the Navy was cool. but that has no theory of sea power, right? It's a fascinating movie in that it's not about sea power, but it's about the Navy. It's about air power. And, you know, to the extent that you would understand us as being in this age of air power where we lionize global reaching global power, Top Gun contributes to that, even though this was not something that the people who underwrote the production of Top Gun actually wanted, right? And all that, that's not a very complicated story. It's just it's a story about complexity, right? That things are complicated.
Do you see that? Do you see the popularity of a movie like Battleship now as an indicator of the decline of air power that you've been tracking? I mean, you can't really do an air power movie now because it would be about some guy in a Kansas warehouse piloting a drone, and how exciting is that, right? Is there a sense that, as far as the Hollywood archetype of what warrioring is about, that because of the rise of UAVs and other more standoff approaches to air power, that this is not part of our warrior culture in the same way anymore, and therefore we have to look elsewhere to create our war. I mean,
I think that's why we get active valor, right? I mean, you might argue that we're in the age of special forces now, and so we get a movie about special forces. That's fascinating because it's not just a movie. It's not Navy SEALs with Charlie Sheen. It's Navy SEAls with actual Navy SEAls, which is sort of a way of a not particularly successful, as I understand it, way of breaking this wall. But at the same time, if we were to go by, I don't think there has ever been a movie which lionizes the U.S. Army to the extent that Saving Private Ryan does. And yet no one speaks of 1998 as the golden age of the Army. Right? And yet that is such an Army movie in every way, which has an Army identity to its core, right? And Army professionalism to its core, and does that understanding, and the understanding of the relationship between the Army and society in every way that the Army wants to think about itself. That's how Saving Private Ryan works. And it was also staggeringly successful and everything else, and yet we don't think of ourselves as being in the era of the Army in any meaningful sense. All right, with that, I think we've gone on for quite a while.
We have. We have.
We are going to talk again because we need to talk more about air power.
We do.
And we're going to talk about targeting and air power. I hopefully have a book coming out about air power. Still possible it couldn't happen, but I'm hopeful.
When will that be out, Robert? When is it?
Theoretically, April of 2013.
Great.
April of 2013 is now the publication date.
Looking forward.
So.
And
well, isn't everyone? I think everyone here who watches Foreign Entanglements on a regular basis ought to buy a copy, and then after 50 copies are done, we'll see where we go from there. So. Well,
I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to reading your scathing review of Battleship next month after it comes out at Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and perhaps...
Well, I feel duty-bound to watch Battleship, and so I will be writing, both for Lawyers, Guns, and Money and for information dissemination. I'll be writing something up on Battleship.
Fabulous. Well, in the meantime, it has been wonderful talking with you.
All right.
And we'll talk again after the airing of this Sunday's Game of Thrones episode.
Yes,
possibly on Twitter.
Okay.
Have a good one.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
Bye.